Well, hello there again in this Advent season. And I'm about to speak on Luke 1, 46b through 55. And that particular text is all about the Magnificat of Mary. And this, of course, endures elsewhere in the sort of Bigrapha, in Odes of Solomon, and is used extensively in liturgy. And by the way, if you're willing, would you just pause right now and go to the previous recording where I read aloud for you my own somewhat free but poetic translation of this text. And I explained there why I have translated the way I have. But now to some of the insights that come to me as I've lived with this text for many, many days and reflected and studied on the aspects of its language and its history. This is a magnificent feat that the writer we call Luke has accomplished. And it is magnificent in at least three senses. One is its pure artistry, the actual manipulation of language that is so artfully done and reflects his extreme literary ability in other parts of Luke and Acts. That's on the very top, surface level. But below that, two things are extraordinary. Luke has done a remarkable job of echoing exactly important aspects of the Hebrew epic. And he's done that in two ways, specifically in style, but also in what I would call echoes. And let me talk about that just for a moment. If you look at this reading of Mary's song very carefully, and you know your Old Testament very well, and especially if you happen to be a scholar and knew your Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, what you would find is that as you read slowly through this, you are getting just pings of echo again and again and again. And those echoes are in diverse aspects of the Hebrew epic, different genre. You would hear echoes from the prophets. You would hear echoes of, many times over, the Psalms. And you would hear echoes quite distinctly of other pregnancy stories. Primary amongst those would, of course, be the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Luke has basically shaped the Song of Mary according to the Song of Hannah. You ought to take a look at that. That's really significant. But beyond that, I think it's the literary genius of Luke that is most impressive. And he does this in an interesting way. For instance, the very first word, and the reason I translated the way I did is because the very first word in Mary's song of significance is this mega word. It's a pretty rare word in general ancient Greek, classical Greek, but perfectly understandable. But where you see it often is in the Psalms. And so if you knew your Psalms and you knew them in the Greek translation, as certainly many of his contemporaries did, what you would be hearing would be the Psalms, the Psalms. Great, great. And if you look at the Hebrew word, this word would be translated in parallel Hebrew places in the Psalms by different kinds of words. Quite often the word gadol, which means great. Think of the mega word, And by the way, I have used that mighty or mega term often in my translation because later on it is great or mighty praise that Mary is singing, and then later it talks about the mega great God. Absolutely astounding. And there are other things. For instance, he uses this alleluia verb, which is really kind of something we can't do in English. But when I translate shouting hallelujah. I do that because that's that in Hebrew, that alleluia word that gets translated over, just transliterated over into the Septuagint. And so we have these echoes again and again and again. But now I want to talk about the connection with prophets. Because in this design of Hebrew parallelism that we see, in other words, you say one thing in a phrase and then you repeat it with synonyms in the next, and then you get antithetical parallelism in which you say the bad are this, but the good are this, or reverse. There we find in the heart this echo of the prophets, where Luke picks up perfectly that kind of juxtaposition of the greed and injustice of the rich, the arrogance of the rich, and God's preference for the poor. Oh, you see, I said that word preference. This reminds us that Luke's gospel, beginning with the Magnificat, has been for liberationists the key gospel, and the Magnificat actually the battle cry psalm of the liberation of people. And of course, what Luke is doing here is quite evident. He is starting out the whole plot of Luke Acts in a way to demonstrate that the promise of liberation for all peoples begins with Israel, but through the prophet Jesus, there will be finally a recognition by his disciples and followers and the apostles that this message is not simply for the redemption of the Israel, but actually a new people of God that includes everyone. And therefore it is the greatest act of the salvation history. So Luke ties the salvation history of the Hebrew epic with the advent of Jesus, who is announced as Hannah announced the prophet Samuel with this song of victory. Well, it's wonderful, wonderful stuff. Much more in there, but I encourage you to follow these lines of thought, meditate on them, think about them, and then do your own creative thinking inwardly. And if you're preparing to preach, for the folks going to hear this beautiful, beautiful Song of Mary utilized at liturgy. Well, thanks so much. I know I've talked a little bit over my 5 minutes today, but it's only because this Song of Mary has absolutely set my heart singing. Thanks so much for watching.